They thought breaking my daughter in front of me would silence both of us forever. They thought the family name, the wealth, and the suffocating control they had over all of us would keep me obedient, just as it had for years. But what they did not know, what they could never understand, is that the moment Victor's fists landed on Rachel and her small body collapsed to the floor in a pool of blood, something inside me broke free that had been chained for decades. I had been raised in a house where silence was survival, where my father's voice was law, where my mother's sneer was the measure of worth, and where my older brother's violence was excused as strength. I endured it because I thought I had no choice but when his rage turned against my child, when my parents laughed as if her suffering were entertainment. I knew in that instant the silence was over. Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a tradition, a time for family to gather in the grand dining room of my parents' estate. The table glittered with polished silverware, the turkey glistened under crystal chandeliers, and the air carried the smell of cinnamon sage and wealth that was never meant for me. I sat with Rachel, my 16-year-old daughter, the only light I had managed to protect in this pit of shadows, and I told myself I could endure one more night of their arrogance for the sake of appearances. But appearances mean nothing when cruelty rules. It started with words as it always did. Victor, my brother 3 years older than me, and still treated as the golden heir, raised his glass and mocked Rachel. He called her weak, said she would never carry the family name with pride, said she was a burden I had inflicted on the Hayes legacy. His voice was loud enough that forks paused, wine glasses trembled, and cousins looked down into their plates. Rachel's cheeks flushed red, her eyes shining with the sting of humiliation, and I wanted to intervene, but I froze. I have frozen all my life. Before I could gather myself, Victor stood towering over her. The room grew quiet, but no one moved. He shoved her chair back, his hand gripped her arm, and in one swift motion his fist slammed into her face. The sound cracked through the dining room like a gunshot. Rachel's body flew sideways, her head hitting the marble floor with a sickening thud. Blood spread across the polished stone, and for a moment the world stopped. My scream tore through the silence. I rushed to her, cradling her head in my lap, feeling the warm blood soak into my dress. Her eyes fluttered once, then closed her body limp. "Rachel, stay with me. Baby, stay with me." I begged, my voice shaking. I looked up desperate for help, for someone, anyone to care, and what I saw burned into my soul. My father, Charles, leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, smirking as though nothing more than a show had played out. My mother, Margaret, laughed softly, her eyes cold as steel, and said, "She needs to toughen up. This will make her stronger." Around the table, relatives averted their eyes. Some pressing lips tight to hide nervous smiles, others sipping their drinks as if this brutality was routine. No one moved to help. No one called for an ambulance. No one dared confront Victor, who stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes daring me to challenge him. In that instant, I understood the depth of the sickness that bound this family. This was not a dinner. This was a theater of cruelty, and my daughter had become the sacrifice. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever known. I screamed at them, cursed them, demanded they call for help, but my words fell against a wall of indifference. They had always dismissed me, silenced me, diminished me, but now they had gone too far. I lifted Rachel in my arms, her blood dripping onto the carpet, and I stumbled out of that glittering room of monsters. Every step toward the door was a declaration, every heartbeat a vow. My parents thought they could bury this in silence. Victor thought his fists were law, but they were about to learn what happens when a mother decides she has nothing left to lose. That night, as I carried my unconscious daughter to the car with my family's laughter echoing behind me, I swore I would fight back. I swore I would make them pay. I swore this was the last time they would ever laugh at our pain. When I was a child, the Hayes estate looked like a palace. To outsiders, it was the picture of success, white columns that reached toward the sky, manicured lawns that stretched for acres, and a driveway so long that guests felt as if they were arriving at a kingdom. But kingdoms have rules, and ours was ruled by silence, control, and fear. My father, Charles Hayes, was a man who spoke in commands, not conversations. His word was law, and his expectations were carved in stone. He built his fortune through ruthless business deals, crushing competitors without remorse, and he expected the same merciless drive from his children. But I was not the child he wanted. I was born second a daughter when what he prized most was a son who could carry the family name like a banner. My older brother Victor was groomed to be that banner from the day he took his first steps. While I learned to smile politely and disappear when told Victor was celebrated for every achievement, no matter how small. If he brought home a grade barely passing, Father called him brilliant. If I brought home honors, Father dismissed me with a wave of his hand, saying, "That's what girls are supposed to do." My mother Margaret was no comfort. She was the silent enforcer, her smile as sharp as glass. She knew her power came from standing beside Charles and feeding his narrative, so she reinforced every word he spoke. When Victor mocked me, she laughed. When Father humiliated me, she nodded. And when I cried in the night, she told me tears were weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. Victor grew in this soil of indulgence, and like a weed, he spread unchecked. By the time he was a teenager, he had learned that violence got him what he wanted. He broke a neighbor's arm in a fight, and Father congratulated him for showing dominance. He shoved me down a flight of stairs when I was 15, and Mother told me to be careful next time, as if my fall was my fault. The family's wealth shielded Victor from consequences, buying silence, covering scandals, ensuring that police reports disappeared. For years, I swallowed the pain, telling myself that survival meant endurance. But then Rachel was born, and everything changed. She was my reason to keep breathing in a world that suffocated me. From the moment I held her in my arms, tiny and perfect, I promised myself I would give her the love I had never known. She grew into a girl with eyes that sparkled with kindness, a heart that believed in fairness, and a courage I envied. But to my parents, she was nothing more than an extension of me and therefore worthless. They barely acknowledged her existence, and when they did, it was with criticism. They said she was too soft, too polite, too much like me. Victor took every opportunity to reinforce that cruelty. He called her names, mimicked her voice, and once when she was only 12, he pushed her into the pool, knowing she could not swim. She almost drowned before I dragged her out. When I screamed at him, Father told me to stop overreacting, and Mother told me boys would be boys. That phrase, those 4 words, became the anthem of my despair. By the time Rachel was 16, she had learned to carry herself with quiet strength. She excelled in school, despite their constant dismissal. She volunteered at shelters. She dreamed of becoming a doctor. She was everything good in me magnified, and I clung to her as proof that we were not defined by the cruelty of this family. But cruelty has a way of circling back, of demanding submission. Thanksgiving that year was different, though I did not yet know why. My parents had summoned everyone to the estate with unusual urgency, insisting that this dinner would be historic. The cousins whispered that Father was planning to announce changes to the will, that Victor was being positioned to take even greater control of the family's businesses. I dreaded the night, but I told Rachel we would be fine if we stayed quiet, ate our meal, and left as soon as we could. I was wrong. Walking into the grand dining room that evening, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. The chandeliers blazed, the table stretched endlessly, the walls gleamed with portraits of ancestors who stared down with judgment. Rachel walked beside me, her dress simple but elegant, her hair pulled back neatly. She was nervous, I could feel her hand trembling in mine, but she smiled at me anyway, whispering, "It's just dinner, Mom. We'll get through it." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that a night could pass without humiliation. But then Victor arrived, his voice booming, his presence demanding attention. He strutted into the room like a conqueror, every step echoing arrogance, and behind him, my parents followed, their heads high, their eyes scanning the room like royalty surveying subjects. From the very first toast, I felt the tension coil like a snake ready to strike. Father's words dripped with condescension. Mother's laughter cut through the air like glass, and Victor's smirk told me he had plans. Rachel tried to focus on her plate to disappear, the way I had learned to do, but Victor never allowed silence. He targeted her with precision, mocking her intelligence, belittling her dreams, and when his words drew no reaction, he escalated. His eyes darkened, his voice sharpened, and the room grew colder with every syllable. I should have known. I should have seen the storm coming. but years of conditioning had taught me to wait, to endure, to hope it would pass. Only it did not pass. It exploded, and when it did, my daughter paid the price. The foundation of our family had always been control through fear, but that night revealed something worse. It was not just control, it was entertainment. My parents did not simply tolerate Victor's cruelty. They delighted in it. They laughed as if Rachel's suffering was a performance, as if her blood on the floor was the climax of a play they had been waiting to see. That was the night I realized there was no saving this family. There was no appealing to their conscience, no begging for compassion. There was only one choice left to fight back with every ounce of strength I had buried inside me. The night fractured in a single, violent moment. 1 second, Rachel was sitting beside me, cheeks flushed but chin lifted in quiet defiance, and the next she was sprawled on the cold marble floor, blood pooling beneath her head. Victor's fist still hovered in the air as though frozen in triumph, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. For an instant the room was silent except for the ringing in my ears. Then came the laughter. My father chuckled low, swirling his wine as though savoring the flavor of my child's pain. My mother leaned toward him, whispering something I could not hear, but punctuating it with a laugh so cold it sent a shiver through me. Around the table, cousins smirked nervously, some turning away, others pretending to focus on their plates. Not one person rose from their chair. Not one reached for a phone. Not one cared that my daughter was bleeding on the floor. I dropped to my knees, my dress soaking in her blood, my hands trembling as I lifted her head onto my lap. Her eyes fluttered once, then rolled back, her body limp. "Rachel, please stay with me," I begged, my voice cracking. My hands pressed against her wound, desperate to stop the flow, but crimson seeped between my fingers. I looked up screaming for someone to help, but they just watched. Father smirked. Mother scoffed. Victor sneered, towering over us, and muttered, "Pathetic." Something inside me snapped. I screamed for an ambulance, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, but my father waved his hand dismissively. "Don't be dramatic, Monica. She's fine. Toughen her up." Those words seared into my memory. Fine. She was unconscious, bleeding, her pulse fading beneath my touch. And yet to him, to all of them, she was nothing more than an inconvenience. When I reached for my phone, Victor kicked it from my hand. It skittered across the floor, smashing against the base of a chair. Gasps rippled around the table, not out of concern for Rachel, but at the audacity of me trying to call for help. My mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You will not embarrass this family with a scene. Do you understand me?" I could barely breathe, fury choking me, but I refused to answer her. Instead, I scooped Rachel into my arms, her blood staining my sleeves, and staggered toward the door. My father's voice followed me deep and commanding. "Walk out that door, and you are no longer one of us." For a moment, the weight of decades pressed down on me. The fear of losing the little security I had clung to, the terror of standing alone against the empire they had built. But then Rachel's body shuddered weakly in my arms, and I knew there was nothing left to lose. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, their laughter chasing me into the night, and carried her to my car. The drive to the hospital was a blur of tears and terror. I pressed one hand against her wound, the other gripping the wheel, whispering over and over, "Hold on, baby, hold on." Every red light felt like an eternity, every second a battle against time. By the time I reached the emergency entrance, my dress was soaked through. Nurses rushed forward, prying her from my arms, questions tumbling from their mouths. What happened? How long has she been unconscious? Was there a fall? I opened my mouth, but the words stuck. How could I explain that her own family had done this, that my parents had laughed, that my brother had beaten her into a coma while others watched, shame and fear twisted inside me, but I forced myself to speak. My brother hit her. At dinner. My parents. They did nothing. The nurses exchanged glances, and one of them nodded grimly. "We'll take care of her. Sit down, ma'am." Hours blurred in the sterile light of the waiting room. I paced, I prayed, I screamed silently at the walls. Every time a doctor walked by, my heart leapt and crashed. Finally, a surgeon approached, his face grave. Your daughter suffered a traumatic brain injury. She's in a coma. We've stabilized her, but the next 72 hours are critical." His words echoed through me like thunder. A coma. My daughter, 16 years old, her life hanging by a thread because of the family I had been too afraid to leave. I collapsed into a chair, shaking my fists clenched. I swore in that moment that if she survived, I would burn down every wall that had ever caged me. But even as I sat in the hospital, the cover-up began. My father's lawyers arrived within hours, sharp suits and sharper tongues. They spoke to hospital administrators, insisting this was a family matter. They suggested Rachel had fallen, that I was hysterical, that stress had clouded my memory. My mother arrived with a change of clothes for me, her voice dripping with disdain. "You look pitiful. Stop telling lies about your brother. If you want any support, you'll say it was an accident. Support." They had never supported me, and now they wanted me to betray my child to protect their golden son. My brother never showed his face at the hospital. He didn't need to. His power, propped up by my parents, spoke for him. Rumors spread quickly. Relatives whispered that Rachel had slipped on the marble floor, that she had a medical condition, that I was unstable. They spun the narrative so fast that by morning I was already the villain in their story. But I knew the truth. I had seen the fist. I had heard the laughter. I had carried my daughter's broken body through the night, and I would not let them bury this in silence. They thought fear would keep me quiet. They thought power would shield them. They thought I would crumble as I always had. But they had underestimated one thing: a mother with nothing left to lose. The first night, I sat by Rachel's hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of machines that were the only proof she was still alive. Something inside me hardened. I held her hand, so small and pale, against mine, and I whispered every promise I had never dared to speak aloud. I will never let them touch you again. I will never let their lies bury you. I will never be silent again. For hours I replayed the dinner in my mind, the gleam of the chandeliers, the smirk on Victor's face, the laughter of my parents as though her suffering were a joke. That sound haunted me, but it also fueled me. Rage burned where fear had lived. For decades I had been the obedient daughter, the silent sister, the dismissed mother. But sitting in that sterile room surrounded by machines, I realized obedience had bought me nothing but chains, and silence had cost me everything. No more. The doctors warned me the days ahead would be critical, but I refused to sit idly by. While Rachel lay unconscious, I began to gather strength. At first, it was practical. I contacted Angela Carter, an old college friend who had become a lawyer. She had always been fierce, someone who fought with every ounce of her being, and when she walked into the hospital room the next morning, briefcase in hand, I saw in her eyes the same outrage I felt. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steady. I told her about the dinner, about the attack, about the cover-up already forming. Her jaw tightened, her pen scribbled furiously. "They're trying to erase the truth. We won't let them, but you have to be ready for a war." I nodded. I was ready. Angela advised me to start documenting everything. I wrote down every detail I could remember, from the exact words Victor had spat at Rachel to the look on my father's face as he swirled his wine. I recorded my calls with relatives who tried to pressure me into silence. I saved the hospital reports, the surgeon's statements, the nurse's notes. For years, my family had thrived on shadows, on whispers, on silence. I was about to flood them with light, but information was not enough. I needed allies, and so I began to reach out. Aunt Linda was the first. She had always been the quiet outcast, the one who lived modestly away from the estate, the one my parents mocked for lacking ambition. But Linda had something my parents never did: compassion. When I told her what happened, her voice shook. "I always knew Victor was dangerous. I never thought your parents would laugh at something like that." She came to the hospital, sat by Rachel's bed, and held her hand. Her presence was a balm, but more than that, she was a witness. Someone outside the circle of cruelty who believed me. Slowly, others followed. A nurse who had overheard my father's lawyers pressuring staff to alter reports. A cousin who whispered that he had seen everything but had been too afraid to speak. A family friend who admitted he had heard my parents boasting that Monica is losing her mind again to discredit me. Piece by piece, the cracks widened in their facade. The more evidence I gathered, the more my parents pushed back. Their calls came daily. Father's voice was sharp with threat. "If you pursue this, Monica, you'll be cut off completely. No inheritance, no support." My mother's voice was colder. "Do you want to destroy your daughter's future by dragging this family name through the mud?" I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. They had already destroyed her future with their fists and their laughter, but I let them speak, recording every word. Each threat became another brick in the case I was building. Meanwhile, Victor remained silent. He never came to the hospital, never called, never asked about Rachel's condition. His silence spoke louder than words. It was the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable, and for years he had been. But I was going to change that. The transformation was not easy. Fear still clawed at me. At night, when the hospital grew quiet, I would curl in the chair by Rachel's bed, and doubt would whisper. What if I failed? What if no one believed me? What if Rachel never woke up and all I had left was a war I could not win? But every time I looked at her pale and fragile machines breathing for her, I knew there was no other path. She deserved a mother who would fight for her, even if it meant standing against the entire family. Angela became my anchor. She guided me through every step, teaching me how to build a case brick by brick. "They've relied on intimidation for decades," she said one night, flipping through a folder of notes. "But intimidation collapses in the face of truth. We'll show the truth, Monica. We'll force it into the light." I found my voice in those days. I stopped answering my parents' calls with hesitation. I stopped apologizing for existing. When my mother appeared at the hospital uninvited, sneering that I was dramatizing, I stood tall for the first time in my life. "Get out," I told her, my voice steady. "You are not welcome here." She blinked in shock, as though she had never heard me speak with strength, and for the first time I saw fear flicker in her eyes. It was small, fleeting, but it was enough. The transformation was not only in words, but in resolve. I began reaching beyond the family circle, contacting journalists, advocacy groups, anyone who would listen. Most doors closed at first. No one wanted to take on the Hayes name, but persistence is a weapon. I kept knocking, kept telling Rachel's story, and eventually one reporter leaned in. She listened, her eyes widening, and she whispered, "If what you're saying is true, this could expose everything." Hope flickered, fragile but alive. I realized then that this was bigger than just me and Rachel. This was about every silent victim, every dismissed daughter, every golden son excused for cruelty. This was about ripping the mask off a family that had hidden behind wealth and respectability for too long. As Rachel lay unconscious, I became something I had never been allowed to be unafraid. The chains of my childhood shattered with every step I took toward justice. They had always told me I was weak. They had always believed I would break, but they were wrong. I was a mother, and there is no force more dangerous than a mother protecting her child. I thought the silence and the intimidation were the worst weapons my family could use against me, but I was wrong. Their true power was in the lies they crafted, lies so polished they gleamed like truth to anyone outside our walls. I discovered the first of those lies 2 weeks after the attack when Rachel was still lying in a coma, and I was beginning to believe my evidence could pierce through their fortress. Angela arrived at the hospital with a stack of papers in her hand, her expression grim. "They've filed an incident report," she said, placing the documents in front of me. My heart pounded as I scanned the words, my eyes widening. According to the report, Rachel had slipped on the marble floor after tripping on her own shoelace. Victor had supposedly rushed to her side in concern, and my father had immediately called for medical assistance. The nurses' statements were written as if they had been dictated by a single hand, carefully curated to absolve every member of my family. It was a fiction so bold I almost laughed, except laughter caught in my throat like shards of glass. "They're rewriting history," I whispered. Angela nodded. "And they're good at it. They've done this before." That was the twist. The assault on Rachel wasn't the first time. It wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was a pattern repeated and covered, buried under forged reports and silenced witnesses. The truth I had buried in my own heart for years, the shove down the stairs, the bruises I had hidden, the humiliations I had endured, suddenly connected to something larger. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I was part of a system my parents had built, a machinery of lies designed to protect Victor at any cost. Angela looked at me with steady eyes. They're going to use every resource they have to make you look hysterical. They've already planted stories in the local press. Reporters are calling you an unstable single mother prone to exaggerations. They're trying to discredit you before you even speak. My stomach churned, rage and fear tangling together. It wasn't enough that my daughter was lying in a hospital bed. Now they wanted to turn me into the villain. I refused to let them win. Then we fight lies with truth, I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. Angela nodded, but her warning was sharp. Truth alone isn't enough. You need proof they can't erase. So I searched. I begged. I clawed through every shadow looking for light. It was a nurse, young and terrified, who finally cracked. She pulled me aside one evening, her eyes darting nervously. "I was there that night," she whispered. "I saw what he did, but they told me if I said anything, I'd lose my job. I have kids. I can't." Her voice broke. I placed my hand on hers. "You don't have to say anything now. Just write down what you saw. Keep it safe. One day when you're ready, it will matter." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and slipped a folded paper into my palm. On it, scrawled in hurried pen, were the words, "Victor hit her." Parents laughed. Monica carried her out. It was small, fragile, but it was truth. The second crack came from an unexpected place. Aunt Linda, ever the quiet one, remembered something. "There's a camera," she whispered one night at the hospital. My heart skipped. "What camera?" She explained that the dining room had been outfitted with security cameras years ago at my father's insistence to monitor staff and guests. "They'll have erased it," she said quickly. "But maybe not everywhere. Sometimes the system stores backups." Angela's eyes lit with possibility. If we can get access, even a fragment of that footage could destroy their entire narrative. The thought filled me with both hope and dread. Breaking into the estate, confronting the fortress of wealth and secrecy seemed impossible. But then again, I had already done the impossible. I had defied them once, carried Rachel out in my arms, and survived. Why stop now? The next twist came not from hidden cameras, but from the past. Digging through old boxes at Aunt Linda's home, I found letters, correspondence from decades ago. My mother had written to relatives overseas, boasting about Victor's strength, framing his violence as leadership. In one chilling letter, she recounted how he had broken another boy's arm at a school event and called it a sign he will rule one day. I felt sick reading the words, bile rising in my throat. My parents hadn't merely tolerated Victor's brutality. They had celebrated it, nurtured it, weaponized it as proof of his superiority. These pieces of evidence were not yet enough to bring them down, but they were enough to show me the scope of the war. They had covered up Victor's violence for years, built entire narratives to shield him, and twisted reality until no one outside the family could see the truth. The scale of it left me breathless, but it also steeled me. If they had perfected the art of lies, then I would perfect the art of truth. Angela began to draft motions to prepare subpoenas to build a case that could withstand the storm of lawyers my parents would unleash. She warned me it would be ugly, public, and merciless. I told her I didn't care. What was left to lose? Meanwhile, Rachel's condition remained unchanged. Every day I sat by her bed, reading to her, talking to her, telling her what I was doing. "I'm fighting for you," I whispered, pressing her hand. "I'm not afraid anymore." Sometimes I imagined her hearing me, trapped somewhere in the quiet between life and death, gathering strength just as I was. The twist wasn't just in discovering their lies, it was in discovering my own strength. I had always believed I was powerless, but power had never been about their wealth, their estate, their rules. Power was about truth, about persistence, about refusing to let cruelty have the last word. And so, when my father called one evening, his voice cold and sharp, threatening to disown me formally, if I continued, I didn't cower. I listened, then I spoke with a calm I had never known. "You already disowned me the night you laughed at my daughter's blood. There's nothing left you can take from me." I hung up before he could respond. My hands trembled, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. They had unleashed their lies, but I had begun to uncover them piece by piece, and I knew this was only the beginning. The more lies my family spun, the more determined I became to surround myself with people who could not be bought or silenced. I realized quickly that if I tried to fight them alone, I would be crushed. But if I built a wall of allies around me, if I collected voices that could not be erased, then even the Hayes Empire would tremble. Angela was my anchor, but she was only the beginning. She introduced me to a private investigator named Daniel Rhodes, a man with lines etched deep into his face and eyes that had seen too many families destroyed by wealth and power. "I know your kind of story," he said gruffly when we first met. "Rich family golden sons silenced victims. They think money makes them untouchable. But money leaves trails." His confidence steadied me. He began digging immediately, tracing records of settlements tracking down people who had crossed paths with Victor over the years. Within days, he uncovered whispers of bar fights buried by payoffs, sealed records from an old assault charge, and even a former employee from my father's company who claimed he had been beaten by Victor during a drunken rage. They buried this under NDAs and cash, Daniel explained, sliding a folder toward me. "But paper trails bleed eventually, and this one's bleeding." At the hospital, the circle of allies widened. The young nurse who had slipped me the note grew braver visiting my room after her shifts, telling me everything she had overheard. She described the lawyers cornering staff, instructing them on what to say, promising promotions to those who complied. Her hands shook, but her words were steady. "I can't watch them erase this. Not again." She became another thread in the tapestry of truth we were weaving. Aunt Linda remained constant, her quiet strength a balm against the storm. She started reaching out to cousins who had stayed away from the estate, those who had always been on the margins like her. Some ignored her, afraid, but one cousin, Thomas, responded. He admitted he had been in the dining room that night, sitting at the far end of the table, and though he had kept his head down, he had seen it all. His guilt was written in every word he spoke. I should have stopped it. I should have said something. But when Uncle Charles looked at me, I froze. I took his hand. "You don't have to freeze anymore. Just tell the truth." He nodded, tears filling his eyes. Slowly, I felt the balance shift. For the first time, it was not just me against them. It was us against their lies. Angela advised me to take everything public but carefully. "We need to control the narrative. If we rush, they'll spin it. But if we gather enough weight when we speak, they won't be able to bury it." So we began building a case brick by brick. Every nurse's note, every witness statement, every medical record was documented, copied, and stored. Daniel traced financial transactions showing hush money payments connected to Victor's outbursts. Angela drafted affidavits carefully worded to withstand the legal storm. Meanwhile, I began speaking to advocacy groups. At first, they were hesitant. Few wanted to take on the Hayes name, but when they saw Rachel lying pale and silent in her hospital bed, their hesitation cracked. "This is bigger than one family," one advocate whispered. "This is about protecting children everywhere from power that crushes them." They offered resources, connections, and most importantly, a platform. The first time I spoke publicly, my voice shook. It was at a small gathering organized by one of the advocacy groups. I stood in front of strangers clutching a photo of Rachel smiling in her school uniform, and I told the truth. I told them about Victor's fist, my parents' laughter, the cover-up, the lies. For a moment, the room was silent, and I feared they didn't believe me. Then came the applause, hesitant at first, then rising like a wave. People stood, tears in their eyes, and I realized I had done something my parents never imagined. I had found a chorus louder than their silence. News traveled fast after that. Reporters who had once dismissed me began calling. The Hayes name still carried weight, but so did the image of a mother fighting for her comatose daughter. Articles appeared questioning the official reports, highlighting inconsistencies pointing to past allegations against Victor. The narrative began to shift. My parents retaliated with fury. Their lawyers filed motions against me, accusing me of defamation, seeking to strip me of guardianship over Rachel. They painted me as unstable, desperate for money, inventing stories to harm the family legacy. For a moment, fear surged again. What if the courts believed them? What if they tried to take Rachel from me, even as she lay helpless? But Angela was prepared. She dismantled their claims piece by piece, presenting medical reports, witness notes, and the growing list of allies willing to speak. Victor, however, remained silent. His arrogance was his shield, but it was cracking. Daniel discovered that he had been involved in another violent altercation only months earlier this time with a business associate. The matter had been settled quietly with money, but the associate's anger lingered. When Daniel approached him, he agreed to speak. "I was warned never to cross the Hayes family," the man said, his face grim. "But if this is about a child, I won't stay quiet." His testimony became another nail in the coffin of their narrative. All the while, I spoke to Rachel every day. "We're building something, baby," I whispered, holding her hand. "We're not alone anymore. People believe us. People are fighting with us." Sometimes I imagined her hearing me, her spirit gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to return. The case grew heavier, the walls of lies cracking wider. For the first time, I could see a path to justice. It was long, treacherous, and filled with traps my family would set, but it was real. And as the circle of allies widened, I understood something profound my family had always told me. Blood was everything, but blood had betrayed me. The people standing beside me now, Angela Daniel, the nurse, Aunt Linda, the cousin, the advocate, none of them were bound to me by blood. They chose to stand. And that choice was stronger than any legacy built on cruelty. The Hayes family believed wealth made them untouchable, but I had discovered a truth more powerful than wealth solidarity, and with it, I was ready to face the storm to come. I had believed that gathering allies and exposing cracks in their lies would be enough to keep me steady, but the Hayes family was never content with silence. They struck back harder each time they felt their control slipping. The second twist arrived like a knife in the dark, and it nearly broke me. It began with a call from Angela one morning while I sat by Rachel's bed, brushing the hair from her pale forehead. "Monica." Her voice was tight, urgent. "They've filed a petition. They're trying to take custody of Rachel." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "What?" I whispered. Angela explained quickly. "Your parents are claiming you're unstable, that your obsession with blaming Victor is proof you're unfit. They've positioned themselves as the only responsible guardians. If the court grants it, they could move her into a private facility, cut you out entirely." I felt the walls close in. It wasn't enough for them to laugh at her suffering. It wasn't enough to bury the truth under lies. Now they wanted to steal her from me while she lay in a coma defenseless. Rage and terror collided inside me, but Angela's steady voice anchored me. "We'll fight it. We have evidence, but you need to understand they're playing for everything now." That night, as I sat in the hospital, my mother arrived. She swept into the room as though it belonged to her, her heels clicking against the tile. Her eyes roamed over Rachel, then landed on me with icy disdain. "This circus you've created is embarrassing," she said softly. "If you had any sense, you'd sign over guardianship and spare yourself the humiliation." I stood blocking her path. "You will never touch her again." She smirked. "Do you really think anyone will believe you over us? We've been building this family's reputation for decades. You're one woman drowning in her own bitterness." Her words stung, but I refused to show it. I pointed to the door. "Get out!" She lingered for a moment, her smile thin, then left the echo of her heels like a threat in the hallway. The betrayal cut deeper when Daniel returned with more findings. He had traced financial records not just to Victor, but to my father directly, payments to judges' donations to officials, all designed to tilt the scales in their favor. "They're greasing the system," Daniel said grimly. "If this goes to court without overwhelming proof, they'll bury you." It was Aunt Linda who uncovered the next piece. She remembered that years earlier my parents had created a trust fund supposedly for Rachel's education. Curious, she asked a contact to look into it. What came back made my blood run cold. The trust had been drained, millions siphoned out over the years, redirected into shell companies controlled by Victor. My parents had stolen from my daughter not just her dignity, but her future. The betrayal was financial, legal, complete. I stared at the documents, shaking. "They stole from her," I whispered. Angela nodded grimly. "And this is where we turn their power against them. If we can prove financial misconduct tied to her injury, the law won't just see abuse, it will see fraud. That's harder to bury." But the Hayes family anticipated every move. Days later, a story appeared in the press, splashed across headlines. "Troubled mother seeks to destroy esteemed family." It painted me as a bitter divorcee, claimed Rachel's coma was the result of a long-standing medical condition, hinted that I had fabricated the assault to extort money. They published photos of me looking exhausted, disheveled, walking into the hospital. The media turned me into a caricature of instability. I wanted to crumble. For years, I had feared humiliation, and now it was public nationwide. But when I looked at Rachel still and silent, I knew surrender was not an option. I whispered to her, "They think this will break me. But you, my love, you're my strength. I'll never stop." Angela moved fast, countering with our evidence. She arranged interviews where I spoke calmly, clearly refusing to match their venom with hysteria. I told the truth again and again until reporters began to question why my parents refused interviews, why Victor remained hidden. The tide once firmly against me began to shift. The betrayal deepened further when I learned one of my own cousins, someone I had trusted, had been feeding information to my parents' lawyers. Details of our meetings, names of witnesses, even parts of Angela's strategy had been leaked. It explained why every move we made was countered so quickly. For a night I raged, certain all was lost. But Angela, ever composed, simply said, "Now we know. We'll tighten the circle. Their desperation makes them sloppy." And she was right. The more they tried to destroy me, the more evidence piled up of their corruption. Daniel uncovered offshore accounts showing just how deeply Victor's violence had been shielded by money. The nurse who had first slipped me the note finally agreed to sign a sworn statement, her courage solidifying when she saw how far I was willing to go. And Thomas, the cousin who had confessed his guilt, stepped forward publicly. His voice shook as he told reporters, "I saw it. I saw Victor hit Rachel. I saw Charles and Margaret laugh. And I stayed silent because I was afraid. I won't be silent anymore." His testimony cracked the narrative wide open. The second twist wasn't just that they were trying to steal Rachel legally. It was that every betrayal revealed more of their rot. The family I had once believed too powerful to touch was bleeding from 1,000 cuts financial scandals, witness testimonies, leaked documents. But the deeper betrayal was personal. To realize my parents would not only laugh at my child's suffering, but also strip her of her future, her money, her very safety, it ignited a fury that burned hotter than anything I had ever known. As I stood over Rachel one night holding her hand, I whispered, "They've tried to erase you, baby. They've tried to erase me, but every lie they tell only proves the truth louder. I promise you when you wake the world will be different. They will never hurt you again." The war was no longer about survival, it was about justice, and justice was coming. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm I had seen gathering on the horizon for weeks. Every sleepless night, every whispered promise to Rachel, every document Angela and Daniel had gathered, it all funneled into that single moment. I walked into the courthouse with my shoulders squared, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel like the powerless daughter of Charles and Margaret Hayes. I felt like a mother carrying an army of truth. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their cameras flashing microphones thrust forward. They shouted questions. "Monica, do you regret accusing your family? Is this about money? How is your daughter?" I held up the photo of Rachel smiling in her school uniform. My voice did not shake. "This is about my daughter. She is 16 years old, lying in a coma because of violence my family tried to erase. This is about truth." For a moment, the chaos quieted the flash of cameras freezing on her image. Inside, the tension was suffocating. My parents sat at the opposing table, dressed in immaculate suits, their expressions carved from stone. Victor sat between them, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with arrogance. For years, he had lived untouched by consequences, but now he looked like a cornered predator, dangerous and desperate. Their lawyers filled the benches behind them, a small army in dark suits ready to dismantle me piece by piece. Angela leaned close, whispering, "Stay calm. We have the evidence. Let them underestimate you." The proceedings began, and immediately their lawyers launched their attack. They painted me as unstable, dredging up moments from my past, my divorce, my struggles with depression, even old medical bills, as though being human disqualified me from telling the truth. They claimed Rachel's coma was the result of a medical condition, not violence. They presented statements from staff who insisted she had slipped on the marble floor. It was a performance polished by decades of practice, every lie delivered with perfect conviction. For a moment, fear coiled in my stomach. The judge listened intently. The courtroom murmured, and I felt the weight of their money pressing down like chains. But then Angela rose. Calm, steady, relentless. She dismantled their lies one by one, presenting sworn statements from the nurse from Thomas, from others who had broken their silence. She laid out medical records that contradicted their story, showing injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, not a fall. Then Daniel stepped forward with the financial records. He traced the money trail with precision, showing how hush payments had been made within hours of the attack, how trust funds meant for Rachel had been siphoned into Victor's accounts. The courtroom gasped as documents appeared on the projector, black and white proof of betrayal. My parents' faces remained frozen, but I saw Margaret's hand twitch, gripping her pearls tighter. The turning point came when the nurse herself took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but when she looked at me, then at Rachel's photo, something steadied in her. I saw it, she said, her words clear. Victor hit her. His parents laughed. Monica carried her out, and we were told to stay silent. The room erupted in whispers, the judge pounding the gavel for order. No polished lie could erase the raw truth in her voice. Finally, it was my turn. I rose, every eye on me, my palms damp, but my spine straight. I spoke not just as a mother, but as the child they had tried to silence for decades. I told the court about the years of humiliation, the violence I had endured, the way they had excused Victor's brutality. I described the night of Thanksgiving in detail, the sound of Rachel's head hitting the marble, the laughter that followed. My voice broke when I said, "They told me I would lose everything if I walked out that door. But they were wrong. I carried everything that mattered in my arms that night. And I will fight until she wakes, until she knows her mother never gave up on her." Silence filled the courtroom when I finished. Even the judge seemed to pause, weighing the weight of truth against the fortress of lies. The defense tried to recover, but the cracks were too wide. With every piece of evidence, every testimony, their story unraveled. By the end of the day, the courtroom no longer looked at me as a bitter woman lashing out. They looked at me as a mother fighting for her child, and at my family as what they truly were: predators hiding behind wealth. When the judge finally spoke, his words carved through the air like thunder. "This court finds sufficient evidence to move forward with criminal charges against Victor Hayes. Custody of Rachel remains solely with her mother, Monica Hayes." Gasps echoed, reporters scribbled furiously, and for the first time in years, I saw fear flicker in Victor's eyes. My parents remained stoic, but I saw the cracks. Charles's jaw tightened. Margaret's fingers trembled. The empire they had built on silence and intimidation was collapsing in front of them, and they knew it. As I left the courthouse, the cameras flashed again, reporters shouting, voices blending into chaos. But this time, I did not flinch. I held Rachel's photo high and spoke clearly. "This is not just about my daughter. This is about every victim silenced by power. We will not be silent anymore." The roar of support that followed was overwhelming. Strangers cheered, some held signs, others shouted words of encouragement. For the first time, I felt the tide fully turn. I was no longer the quiet, obedient daughter of the Hayes family. I was a mother who had dragged the truth into the light, and the world was watching. But I knew the war was not over. The trial was still ahead, the battles still brutal. My family would not surrender easily. Yet as I walked down those courthouse steps, Angela beside me, Daniel just behind, I felt something unshakable. They had tried to bury us in silence. Instead, they had planted the seeds of their own downfall. The weeks that followed the hearing were a blur of headlines, late-night strategy sessions, and tense hospital visits. Rachel still lay in her coma, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of machines. But for the first time, I felt the weight of justice shifting in our favor. The courtroom showdown had cracked open the facade my parents had spent decades polishing, and once the cracks appeared, the flood poured in. Reporters dug into old stories long buried. Former employees stepped forward, describing how they had been silenced by threats or payoffs. Even a teacher from Victor's school days appeared, recalling how he had terrorized classmates while Charles and Margaret donated generously to keep his record spotless. The narrative that once painted the Hayes family as pillars of respectability was unraveling thread by thread. Victor was arrested 2 weeks later. I was sitting by Rachel's bed when the news broke. Daniel burst into the hospital room, his phone in his hand, his eyes blazing. "They've taken him into custody," he said. "Assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Financial misconduct may follow." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, relief crashed over me like a wave. It wasn't victory not yet, but it was a beginning. The trial that followed was brutal. My parents' lawyers fought like wolves, attacking every witness, twisting every word. They argued Victor had been provoked, that Rachel had exaggerated her discomfort, that my testimony was colored by bitterness. But each time they struck, Angela countered with precision. The nurse testified again, stronger this time. Thomas spoke publicly, his guilt transmuted into courage. The financial records showed indisputable fraud. And when the surveillance footage was finally unearthed, a fragment recovered by Daniel from a forgotten backup drive, it silenced the courtroom. The grainy video showed Victor rising from his chair, his fist connecting with Rachel, her body collapsing to the floor. And in the background, my parents laughed. The jury deliberated only 6 hours. When they returned, the words rang out like bells in a cathedral. "Guilty on all counts." Victor's face drained of color, his arrogance cracking for the first time in his life. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, his empire of impunity collapsing with the clang of the judge's gavel. But the justice did not end with him. Investigations opened into my father's financial dealings, into the trust funds siphoned into shell companies, into the hush payments that had kept Victor free for years. Margaret was subpoenaed, her icy composure finally slipping as she stumbled through questions she could not answer. The Hayes family name, once untouchable, became synonymous with corruption and cruelty. Through it all, I returned to the hospital every night. I read to Rachel. I told her about the trial, about the people who had stood up about the truth, finally breaking free. I told her she was the reason I had found my voice, that every step of the fight had been for her. And one quiet morning, as sunlight spilled through the blinds, her fingers twitched in mine. I froze, scarcely daring to breathe. Then her eyes fluttered open, groggy, confused but alive. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "You came back, baby. You came back." Her recovery was slow, but each day she grew stronger. She listened as I told her what had happened, how her uncle had been convicted, how her grandparents' lies had been exposed. At first, her eyes filled with pain, with disbelief. They laughed. She whispered, her voice hoarse. I knotted my throat tight. "Yes, but the world knows now, and they can never hurt you again." The day Victor was led away in handcuffs, Rachel sat beside me in a wheelchair, still weak but determined. She watched as cameras flashed, as reporters shouted questions, and she lifted her chin. "He thought he could break me," she whispered. "But we broke him." I kissed her forehead, pride swelling in my chest. The resolution was not just in the prison sentence or the investigations. It was in the shift that rippled outward. Advocacy groups used our story to push for reforms in how wealthy families shield abuse. Lawsuits were filed by others who had once been silenced. The Hayes empire was no longer a fortress. It was rubble, and from that rubble, truth began to rise. For me, the resolution was quieter but deeper. I no longer flinched when I heard my father's name. I no longer froze when I saw Margaret's face on the news. Their power over me had evaporated the moment I chose truth over fear. And though scars remained on Rachel's body and my heart, they were no longer chains. They were reminders of battles survived, of strength discovered. The final time I entered the courthouse was not for Victor's trial, but for the civil case that followed. The court awarded Rachel full restitution of the stolen trust funds, plus damages for the abuse she had endured. The numbers on the paper meant less to me than the principle. They had tried to rob her of her dignity, her future, her life. Instead, the law had forced them to give back what they had stolen. As we left the courthouse that day, reporters swarmed again, their questions filling the air. But I didn't need to answer. Rachel, standing beside me on unsteady legs, spoke for us both. "We are not victims," she said firmly. "We are survivors, and we will not be silent anymore." The applause that followed was louder than any laughter my parents had ever used to crush us. It was the sound of justice delivered, of chains breaking, of a legacy rewritten. In the months after the trial, life felt like walking through the wreckage of a storm. The Hayes estate still stood its white columns as imposing as ever, but its power was gone. The world knew the truth now. The empire my parents had built on silence and intimidation had crumbled under the weight of evidence and voices they could not buy. Yet even as their world collapsed, mine was beginning to rebuild. Rachel's recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy became part of our daily lives, each step she took a victory carved from pain. There were days she wept frustrated by the weakness in her limbs, haunted by nightmares of Victor's fists. But there were also days when she laughed again when her smile returned, when she told me about her dreams of becoming a doctor, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. "I want to help kids like me, Mom," she said one evening as we sat on the porch of our small rented house. "I want to prove we're stronger than what they did to us." My throat tightened as I hugged her close. "You already have baby. Every day you wake up, you prove it." The community that had rallied around us during the trial did not disappear. Advocacy groups named new initiatives after Rachel programs designed to protect children from abuse hidden behind wealth and reputation. Schools began hosting workshops. Hospitals reviewed their policies. Lawmakers even drafted proposals to limit the influence of hush money in assault cases. It stunned me to realize that our pain had sparked something larger, something that could ripple outward to protect others. Out of the ashes of betrayal, a legacy of protection was being born. But healing was not only about justice or reforms. It was personal, intimate, fragile. I had to unlearn decades of silence to teach myself that my voice mattered even when it shook. Therapy sessions helped me untangle the knots of fear and shame woven through my childhood. For the first time, I allowed myself to speak openly about the stairs Victor had shoved me down the nights I cried into my pillow while my parents sneered. Each confession felt like lancing a wound painful but necessary to heal. Rachel and I created new traditions. No more grand Thanksgiving dinners under chandeliers, no more pretense of family loyalty. Instead, we cooked together in our tiny kitchen laughing as we burned pies and spilled gravy, grateful simply to be free. Christmases were quieter, but warmer, filled with chosen family. Angela, Daniel, Aunt Linda, the nurse who had risked her job to tell the truth, the cousin who had found his courage. Around our table, we spoke not of legacy or wealth, but of resilience, love, and survival. My parents tried, of course, to claw back some semblance of control. They filed appeals, gave carefully staged interviews, attempted to frame themselves as victims of a vindictive daughter. But the world had seen too much. Each attempt only deepened their disgrace. Margaret stopped appearing in public altogether. Charles's once feared company collapsed under the weight of investigations. Victor sat in a prison cell stripped of the arrogance that had shielded him. For years I had lived under their shadow, but now that shadow had withered into nothing. One evening, months later, Rachel and I visited the hospital where she had once lain unconscious. We donated part of the restitution money to fund a new wing for victims of violence, a place where no child would be silenced by wealth or intimidation. A plaque was unveiled, the Rachel Hayes Center for Healing. My daughter stood beside me, her hand squeezing mine, tears glistening in her eyes. "They tried to erase me," she whispered, "but now my name will protect others." My heart swelled with pride and grief, joy and sorrow entwined. "That's the greatest revenge," I said softly, turning their cruelty into something that saves. Looking back, I realized the story was never just about one night, one fist, one laugh. It was about generations of silence breaking about, reclaiming power stolen for decades. It was about proving that family is not defined by blood or wealth, but by love, by those who choose to stand beside you when the world turns dark. My parents had lost everything because they chose cruelty. I had gained everything that mattered because I chose truth. On the anniversary of the trial's verdict, Rachel and I stood on a stage at a community event. The room was filled with survivors, advocates, and families who had found courage in our story. Rachel, her voice steady, spoke into the microphone. "I was told I was weak. I was told my pain didn't matter. But my mom fought for me, and because she did, I'm here today. If you're listening and you think you can't speak, I want you to know you can. And you deserve to be heard." The applause that followed was thunderous, tears streaming down faces across the room. I stood behind her, my heart overflowing. That night, as we drove home, Rachel leaned her head against the window, exhausted but smiling. "Do you think they'll ever regret it, Mom? Do you think Grandpa and Grandma will realize what they did?" I was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, maybe not. But it doesn't matter. What matters is we're free. What matters is you're alive and we're building something they can never touch. She nodded, her eyes closing softly. I glanced at her into the passenger seat, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights, and I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. The war had scarred us, yes, but it had also forged us. I was no longer the silent daughter of a cruel dynasty. I was Monica Hayes, a mother who had fought back a woman who had reclaimed her voice. And as long as I breathed, I would never let silence rule again.